What is up? It has been a hot minute since I've done one of these videos, like a hot minute. And I turned 50 last week. And one of the commitments I made to myself was, you know what? I enjoy getting emails and texts letting me know that people left comments on videos because I'm helping people. And I got away from making these videos. When Amazon stopped hiring a little under 2 years ago, I basically stopped making videos because, man, the traffic to my channel just died. I can see that people are starting to hire again, starting to get more inquiries. So you know what? I'm back, baby. I'm back. So I'm going to commit to doing at least one of these a week, if not more, because I want to help you land your dream job. Now, let's talk about framing. We use the Amazon leadership principles to help you frame out how to address questions that are asked of you. In this specific interview, it is an "are right a lot" question, and we are specifically looking for, do you make decisions quickly with data and they have significant outcomes for the company? And the question that we'll get into with the candidate is more around an error in judgment, right? So when did you do it wrong? So now we're also looking for accountability and ownership. But this candidate is a mid-level guy, despite his resume having some titles on it that were a bit crazy, and you'll see a bit of that in the interview. Mid-level guy looking for an L6 role within Amazon. That's actually where he was targeting. And he was looking for an account executive role. He's kind of a sales biz devy type guy. Anybody can benefit from watching these videos. It's not just people targeting Amazon. If you're interviewing at any tech company, quite honestly, at any knowledge work company, you're going to get these behavioral questions. And my goal, my commitment to you is to help you understand how you can fall into traps, the things that you can miss, and the way that you're setting up the interviewer to torpedo the whole interview, right? You're feeding them a mistake in a way that causes them to kind of pull back and say, oh, maybe this person's not for me. And then they start asking you hard questions in an unnecessarily difficult way. It torpedoes the whole interview. So with that as preamble, let's just jump right into it. L6, account executive, let's go. I am going to time box this for 24 months. Right, as in the last 24 months. And I want you to talk about an error in judgment that you made that was related to your team or leadership, or something that specifically meant it impacted not just you, but members of an extended team in a direct way, right? What was it and what was the impact? One of the things that you need to keep in mind when asked a question like this, an error in judgment, there's a lot of things that as an interview, I would absolutely be looking for from a candidate. First of all, how big of an error was it? Do they understand the scope of the error? Are they willing? Do they have the humility to admit to it? But does the size and scope of it align with the role expectation for the role they had, as well as the role expectation for the role that they're trying to get? Also, how did they get there? Was there sound business judgment and data-based decision-making that got there, or were there errors in that path that got them there? And do they realize this? Do they even understand this? And finally, because this particular candidate was interviewing for a manager role, how did they go about solving the problem? Meaning, did they seek out help from within the organization, within their team, experts outside the organization? How do they go about finding the best path forward when something like this impacts customers?
Sure. And I'm just writing that down.
That's fine. In general, just say I'm taking notes, and that's enough.
Yeah. So I think the one that comes to mind here started in 2021. So last year, I think it was around November. So Quaylap, just for a little bit of background, is a core banking system provider. So we make the loan management software, a core banking system provider. So we make the loan management software that a financial institution, in our case, they're called financial cooperatives, uses to run its business.
Okay.
Now that's some important background. Another piece of important background is that in 2021, we were kind of doing a bit of a pivot in terms of our customer base and expanding who we were targeting. So in addition to our traditional line of business, which was with financial cooperatives, we were exploring how we might get into a space called embedded lending, where we use our software, specifically our reporting, data analytics, and database backends, to connect with and partner with other service providers, other application providers in our market to help them to expand and offer loans to their customers. So specifically, we were working in 2021 for this particular case with a retail technology provider called Cashier. Now, what Cashier produces is a application for micro businesses to run
I'm sorry, this was a provider called Cashier?
Yes, an application provider called Cashier. And they make an app, essentially a POS app and an inventory management app for small businesses in Indonesia, which is where this particular deal was.
One of the questions I get more than this is probably the most common question I get is how long should an answer be? What is the right amount of time to speak? And it depends on where you go on YouTube and who you listen to. And you'll hear anything from, a minute for your answer to, no more than 10 minutes. Being purely objective about this, let's be clear. Your answer should be only as long as it needs to be and not one word longer. That's a fair way to approach this. And that scale is going to move based on how big a role you had, how big a problem, the story, etc. But one thing that you absolutely must keep in the front of your mind is how long are you actually speaking before you get to addressing the question that was asked. And in this case, the candidate's been speaking almost 2 minutes. And as an interviewer, I still don't know what the error in judgment was. I don't want the takeaway from that to be never provide background information. Background information is critical, but one of the keys to executive communication is having the ability to kind of get to what's important and present it as quickly as possible with as little background material as needed, again, based on the audience, but also without a long, drawn-out setup. Because the risk of what can happen here is I, as the interviewer, lose the thread. And I spend a lot of calories trying to, what's he talking about? What's important? What's not important? I still don't know what's important here. But I've just listened for 2 minutes trying to now stitch together what's actually happening. So the length of the answer is not the takeaway here. It's the how long are you talking before you specifically address the question that was asked.
To run their business and run their storefront. What we wanted to do with this business, as I said, is to help them to take their data, the data they had, and use it to help their customers get loans. We wanted to spin up that loan program together. Now, that opportunity was identified and brought to us by our business development team who was in Indonesia. Now, in 2021, and still to this day, I was the executive vice president of international business development. And so I had responsibility for that team. And they actually pulled me into the account as sort of a cavalry, the executive to help deal with their C-level suite as we were talking through these particular negotiations. So that was all a bunch of all of the backgrounds. Now, in terms of where this error in judgment came in, as we were...
Just to make my point, the candidate went on for well over another minute here before they addressed the actual error in judgment. Background is important. It is important, don't get me wrong. But background can find its way into the story over time. You don't need to front load it because the risk is you might lose the interviewer.
Working with Cashier, what Cashier said that they wanted to do was essentially build a consumer-facing marketplace where one of their customers could come in and pick from a bunch of different loans and loan providers and apply to them, get the loan, and get the loan distributed to their bank account. Now, that sounded really exciting to us, sounded really exciting to me. And so I wanted to push ahead with it. And so we did. However, where this was the error in judgment, and the error in judgment came in through the fact that that is in fact a regulated space. It is what is called either a financial aggregator, because you're aggregating all of these lenders and loan products, or a peer-to-peer marketplace. Both of those require a license, which at the time, Quaylap did not have. And to this day, we still don't have it, in the process of applying for it. That error in judgment ultimately...
Is it one single license for, not that this matters, is it one single license for each of those, or is it for or one single license covers both?
No, you would need a license, and you need to pick: do I want to be a financial aggregator? Do I want to be a marketplace?
Okay.
So that was the error in judgment. The impact that had on my team is that they, of course, had this deal that they were excited about, that they were wanting to move forward with, which essentially I had now told the customer that we could do this particular transaction, do this particular deal, and provide them with this particular kind of software, which we couldn't. And that really led to a bunch of challenges for that team in particular that they would then have to deal with. Ultimately, what it meant is that they had to renegotiate this deal with Cashier. And I should point out, or I should have said earlier, that Cashier's user base is 850,000 consumers in Indonesia, which by Indonesia standards puts them about in the middle of the market, but by most standards, I would consider a pretty big application service provider. So that both caused them a lot of heartache in terms of, oh, we've got this issue now with the customer, and it also created some concerns about their ability to hit their goals, because as we were looking at this process, we had developed some projections that we wanted the business development team to hit, and it was something like 500,000 in year one in revenue.
500,000 what?
500,000 in revenue.
Okay.
So we wanted them to hit 500,000 in revenue in year one and bumping up to 1.2 million in year two. That was basically off the table because they had to go back to the drawing boards. That second thing, the issue of them not hitting their targets, that's a lot easier for me to solve as their leader, their report, because I can say, well, that was my oopsies, not your guys's. And so I'm not going to hold you accountable to these goals that I've now made challenging. The real issue, again, was now they have to deal with pushing through these issues with the customer.
Well, hold on. Throughout the entirety of that setup and front-loaded part of the answer, this particular candidate, who in the end I liked a lot, this was the first of our 6 questions that day. It's almost the style of delivery makes it seem like it was kind of a ho-hum, no big deal kind of problem. But let's break this down. Like when we're thinking about errors in judgment, let's actually talk what happened here. He has a team that's working with a provider that they're trying to sell into. Okay. He's brought in as the executive vice president. So that's, as high in it could be a small organization, of course, but that's meant to convey competence and ability, right? To step into a conversation with, he said it was a middle market provider, but 850,000 customers is a lot. That's a company that has a lot of revenue, probably. Their expectations are fairly high of people that they allow to do themselves to do business with. And you, as the executive vice president, come in and say, yes, we can do that. But oops, I forgot we don't have this license that we probably need to be able to do that. That is a massive, massive, massive miss. And the way he talks about it and frames it almost makes it feel like it wasn't that big a deal, which is there's 2 sides to that, which is one, if I'm the interviewer and I don't know any better, I don't have the level of experience, I might be like, oh, that sounds like a bummer, but I guess they work through it, move fast and break things. But as a more senior person, I'm listening to this, I'm getting a little bit of heartburn. I'm getting worried because I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, how did he not know this? How did he not understand what they couldn't do, the licensing? I mean, it's not like this deal just showed up out of nowhere, just showed up on his doorstep. He's like, oh yeah, I'm going to show up. I'll be there on Friday. And he walks into the room. He's like, yes, we can do all the things, and sells into a company things, features and functionality that don't exist. That's not what happened here. He fundamentally didn't understand the licensing requirements to do business with a company like that in the country he was in, and he's the executive vice president of international business. Yikes. So from a judgment standpoint, now I'm concerned. The good news is for this candidate. It was a bit of an overinflated title. It was a smaller company. And for the role that he was targeting, it's a much lower level role. So that that's a whole different discussion about the gap between the roles you've had, the kind of name roles that you've had on your resume, and what you're actually applying for. There was a huge gap there, which made it almost feel like he was applying way below what he was capable of doing, but it turns out he was applying for the right level role. All that said, this is a huge miss, but he hasn't really addressed how it would impact the customer. That's a problem. He hasn't really talked about how he missed on the data aspect of this, which is kind of the understanding of the rules and regulations. And so there are concerns, and that's where the follow-up questions will now lead into this. He has set the table for somewhat difficult follow-up questions. If you don't mind my asking just one clarifying question, right? It's only a problem with the customer if they put, kind of marketing muscle or weight behind it. But if I would imagine you had to have discovered that you didn't have the proper license well before it went to market, right? Well before the customers actually knew that they were working on this. So why was this impacting their customers?
Well, it did not impact their customer per se, but their relationship with the customer, because now the customer's perspective is, well, Quailap has said that they're going to help us build this software package, but they had not done the due diligence before they had made that commitment. And I will say that we didn't make sort of a contractual commitment, but in Indonesia specifically, it's one of those cultures where your word has a lot of weight and what you say matters. And so from my perspective, it's easy to rush in and say, oh, we'll do this. But from the Indonesian cultural perspective, you really should have done your due diligence before you started making those commitments. And so that the team now has to deal with that customer relationship being a bit eroded and the trust breaking down just a little bit.
Sure, but that's for the relationship with Quailap's customer, but their customers would have had no knowledge of this, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And when I say customer, I purely mean cashier, not cashier's customers one-on.
Got it. Okay. So that was my.
So apologies for that confusion.
No, that's fine. And so I guess the obvious question is, how did you miss this comprehension piece of the market space, right? This necessity of having appropriate licensing. How did that even happen? This was me being nice. There are a lot of ways an interviewer could have asked that question to really smack you around, and we'll call them less socially aware, or maybe me in my 20s, probably even my early 30s, might have been a bit more direct and called the candidate out and said, how did you make this big a mistake? And kind of made a face or said it in a way that was super obnoxious, as if to say, what are you, an idiot? Know that this answer has invited that kind of a response from an interviewer. It's not abnormal. This was pretty bad. And certainly for the level role that this person had or signaling that they had, it's a bit of a yikes alert.
The main issue is that we had, as I had said, so we were making this pivot. We were transforming into this kind of additional service provider role. And as we were going through that, we thought we had found a niche where we provide the data, and that is not a regulated entity. We've gotten legal opinions that state that, worked with lawyers. I had pushed that farther than it needed to be or should have been pushed. And so that is how we missed it. That is how I missed it. That was the error in judgment that I made, is by pushing it to be then a consumer-facing application. That's when you've stepped over the boundary into being a regulated entity. Looking back on it, of course, I should have been doing the due diligence, but I was perhaps it's just from my perspective, perhaps it's a salesperson thing. When I'm in the midst of the deal, I want to get it done. I want to do what the customer wants to get done. And I wasn't taking the appropriate steps to make sure that the legal team had seen it, signed off, and was backing it up.
And this is where the candidate's maturity or lack of shines through. And let me be clear, when I say lack of, I mean executive vice president, you expect a certain level of maturity, really, really solid individual contributor, maybe even manager of ICs, kind of level 6-ish type person. Okay, different level of maturity expectation. This is where his lack of business maturity, overall maturity, business process maturity, having seen and done it all and understands how to process difficult things. This is where it really shined through. He's self-aware enough and humble enough to recognize the size of the mistake and certainly what he did wrong. All of that is positive, net positive. And again, if he was interviewing for a VP level job, this is an absolute no hire. Not a chance. No way, no how. Because you simply can't be making these kinds of mistakes, especially with large customers, any customers, but specifically very large customers, because you're really putting a lot of revenue at risk and reputational damage and a bunch of other problems that come along with it. Plus, you have to imagine the folks that are downstream from this candidate, if he's training them as a sales team, what behaviors and patterns is he actually now putting out to the team as to what's okay? How can you count on this person to kind of check the work? How do you believe leadership is on top of things? Like there's just, a little too much summit fever, wanting to get the deal done, and not enough like, okay, let's make sure we got all our I's dotted and our T's crossed. Think about how I want to ask this question. Yeah, I mean, what is the aftermath of this? What happened?
Well, it's still being worked out. But what we're finding we have to push towards now is a role and an engagement with cashier that is significantly less limited. So we're still going to work with them. We'll still be using their data to help their members get loans. However, the solution that they had wanted is no longer going to be a viable solution in the immediate term. So ultimately, there hasn't been, it didn't blow up the relationship. It didn't kill our prospects with this particular customer. But I will say that it was, as I said, an error in judgment that ultimately undermined my team.
So what did we learn here? First and foremost, Canada has a high degree of humility. That's great. Love that. You'd love to see that, someone who can take accountability for a screw up. That's awesome. But again, this specific question, tell me about a time, an error judgment, that maps to the leadership principle of our right a lot. Can you make sound business decisions quickly using data that impact the business? And in this case, it was a bad decision based on no data or ill-informed data, based on bad process, wanting to get to the finish line instead of actually working through what you should have done. And missing from the answer was a sense of what was the cure, right? How do they fix this? What was the aftermath that really, how did you change what you were doing internally? How did you prevent this from happening again? Because that's a question that I didn't ask here. And probably because I wanted to move on, because I just felt like we'd kind of gotten stuck in a hole here. A clear, obvious question would be, okay, so how did you make sure this never happened again? What procedures did you put in place? What new patterns did you put in place? How did you impact the organization so that you didn't make this kind of mistake again? That's an obvious follow-on question that you should be prepared to answer. And so with the stakes as high as they were, huge customer, big title, and the lack of relative experience on the part of the candidate, it's kind of, it's what made this candidate so difficult to interview. It was just such a big delta between the role that they were interviewing for, target role, and what I'd seen on the resume. And it all came crashing into clear focus in this very first question block of our interview, that this person was massively over-leveled in probably a much smaller company than they should, in a much smaller company that is more likely to over-level people and give people titles to make them seem more important to go get the big deals, etc. That is me pattern matching based on my 3 decades of work, what happened here. And it can lead you to, as a candidate, it can lead you to a bad place in an interview, because if I, the interviewer, have just read your resume, I come into the room with a preconceived notion of you. And if that notion gets shattered, and not in a good way, recovery from that can be extremely hard. So the side lesson here for you as a candidate is be aware of the titles you have on your resume. Be aware of the titles you have on LinkedIn. And you might have been, the chief people pleaser or whatever, or some cutesy name that we used to have back in the 2000 timeframe, or you might have had an overinflated title. You're a vice president of whatever because you work at some investment bank and you're like 23 years old, right? But the reality is certain industries, they understand it, but when you're in a startup and you get that overinflated title, and then you go try to work at a company like Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, the title mismatch is going to be real, and the people reading your resumes are going to look at it and be like, what's going on here? Is this person overqualified for the role? Or why are they trying to get this level? Or is it just they had a big fancy title, so how can I trust anything else in the resume? So it just creates this cognitive dissonance in me, the interviewer, when I come into the room as to what to expect from you, the candidate. And that can actually impact how a lot of the questions go throughout your time with them, because they're just trying to circle around the drain and figure out exactly how to level you. So that's somewhat problematic. So from an our Write A Lot point of view, this is actually a good story. I think there's a lot of good content here. It was poorly delivered, which can be improved upon. The candidate didn't really talk about what they did to get to the point in terms of making the decision that they made, which is the error in judgment. But they kind of got to it, which is they said, I had summit fever and I didn't really do what I should have done, due diligence, to figure out if we had everything, fine. They didn't spend enough time talking about the cure and how they kind of worked within their organization to kind of get to the right answer, figure out how to unwind it, what the stakes were for the unwinding, what actually happened. And then finally, they didn't talk about how they were going to prevent that from happening again within the organization on a go-forward basis. So those are all places where you could take a story and improve upon it for something like this. Okay, real quick, if you want to support the channel, you've got a couple of options. You can sign up for VIP, which is a one-on-one interviews, much like you see here. They can be pretty expensive. I get it. They're not for everybody. You can also buy the content library, where I have hundreds of interview segments that I've done just like this, with all of my notes and the feedback that I gave the candidate. And finally, if you're in the job market and you want to have your resume fixed up for the job description that you're after, go to hiredupon.com and run it through my AI backend. Hopefully you see from the channel content that I'm pretty thorough, and it's not just a copy and paste into ChatGPT. It's quite a bit more going on behind the scenes to make sure that your resume looks perfect for the job description you're after.